Welcome to Lacey Walker Art. Today, we're going to be doing finger painting. This has been something that my friend Dan has been requesting me to do, so, alright Dan, here we go. Today I'm going to be making an acrylic painting. I'm going to try to do one of my landscapes like I typically do, using only paint, a backing, and my fingers. That means I have 10 potential tools. I'm probably going to try to use only one hand to keep this hand clean so I can grab things and not get paint everywhere, or more than it already is. A few things to note, that means I have 5 different fingertips of different widths. I also personally keep acrylic nails on my hands because I'm a chronic fingernail biter, and doing all of my other metal work that I do, it's very painful if I don't have nails. But I can use those for some of the finer details. Let's see what happens.
A little while later, I had done a few other things, and I decided to change into some more paint-appropriate clothes and remove all of my jewelry because I had a feeling this was going to get messy. As you can see from my table, I'm not the cleanest painter. If you see my apron, it's even more covered in paint. So removed all, and also I just finished this bracelet, and I just think it's really cool, so check it out. Anyways, now that all that's done, let's get started. Okay, so the supplies we'll need are some paint. I'm using some basic colors, my fingers, a board. I'm using a hardboard that was a painting I didn't like and I painted over, a palette, and I guess my hands to mix with it. And then I'm going to be keeping some water and some paper towels on hand so that I can dip my fingers in it and clean them off as needed. Let's really get down to business. Once I had all my colors laid out on my palette, all there really was left to do was start mixing. So, I guess I just stick my fingers in the paint and mix up some colors. A lot of times when I'm mixing my colors for a landscape, I actually start with my blues because I kind of want to base my other colors around them. But for this one, I decided to go with my lightest colors first because I wasn't sure how well I was going to be able to wash my hands off, specifically the area kind of underneath my fingernails, in case that would kind of, I don't want green instead of yellow. And if I had a little blue under my fingernail or something. So I went ahead and just kind of tried to use my finger like a palette knife. I would swipe and then scoop, and that's how I typically kind of mix together colors with a palette knife. Swipe, scoop, and kind of mix around until I get kind of the consistency and the mixture that I want. So, I guess this works. I mix my colors light to dark. I'm gonna do the opposite. I don't know what my reasoning here was, other than this is just typically how I do it. And so I tried to use my fingers just like I would a brush. I swiped kind of the top layer, the darkest layer that I want, across the top, and then I always take in my next hue right under it, and then I'll kind of swipe these back and forth together to try to create a gradient. And this actually works better than I thought it was going to. It's not perfect, but it's not that bad. And I continued on down the page just like this, using that same method of placing the color next to the previous one and then swiping up and down and adding more where I needed it. I did notice that as I went further down and the tones and the hues really changed, it did get more and more difficult to create a smooth gradient. as well as you'll see where my fear of getting a little blue that was still under kind of my fingernail area got into the background, and so I had to really kind of work and layer over that because I had suddenly kind of this blue smudge that wanted to mix into everything I was doing with my fingers. The other thing you'll notice is I mainly am using my middle finger, and I don't know why at this point this is kind of my go-to, but it was, so I went with it. And there, that blue is sneaking back up again. So I guess if you're doing this, just make sure your fingers, maybe use a multitude of fingers or something. I finally got wise to this and decided to wash my finger off a little better. And I just did that kind of by dipping it in the water and then rubbing it off with a paper towel. At this point, I decided to kind of call this pretty much good and think of it as a layered sunset happening in the background, because I had kind of moved beyond the point where the paint was still malleable and it was too dry, so I couldn't really blend it back together. And now the part that I've kind of been dreading is getting ready to paint the mountains. My main fear around painting these mountains is usually I go in with kind of a fun brush or an angled brush, and I can kind of use the brush movements to shape different ridges, and knowing that I had only a round fingerprint, it was going to be kind of a little bit more difficult to create subtle irregularities in the mountains. And also, I thought this was kind of funny, but it felt really natural to switch from my middle finger to my index finger to paint the mountains, as if I was going to get more, fine detail with using my middle finger. And so I kind of did my outline, which turned out better than I had expected, and pulled some of that down. And then the other thing I usually do is with my back layer of mountains, I paint kind of a muted gray color, and then I usually hit the tops with kind of a blue to make the very tops of the ridges stand out. You'll notice this if you ever look at the mountains kind of at sunset time. There's almost this like really faded kind of darker line along the tops of the mountains. And so I tried to take my fingernail and kind of strategically place the darker pigment along those tops, and it was really hard to see where I was actually putting the paint, if I was lining it up with the tops of the mountains or not. And then I would kind of go back in and smudge it just a little bit. So I tried a few different techniques. I also tried kind of smudging it up into it, pulling it down, and I finally got something that kind of worked. So I went ahead and did kind of the same thing for all the rest of the layers, where I would lay out kind of the main outline, pull it down, and then we'll get to some of the details in a little bit. For this layer, I decided to do something a little different. I decided to do a counter highlight where I took some of this fuchsia color and kind of laid in some kind of rough ridges and areas where I thought there might be valleys and type things, instead of trying to go from the top. So I kind of lightened the bottom a little bit using a different color instead of the opposite way. As each layer dried, I kind of tried to go back into that dry layer and add a little bit more detail, where I would either take some highlights, some more white colors or some darker colors, and try to very carefully put it in with my fingernail and then use my fingertip to smudge it out. And again, this was really hard to get different details on, but with a little work, it seemed to work okay. I also decided there wasn't really enough distinction between the back layer and the layer in front of it. And so I took some of this darker phthalo blue and tried to very carefully with my fingernail apply it in between the two layers at the very base of the back mountains and the very top, over the top of the mountains that are a little closer to the foreground, and you can kind of see how this starts to make them pop out just a little bit more. But this was really difficult. I tried to use the same principles I usually do in my landscapes, which is just kind of layering these highlights and going back and forth, because the more you do, the more you kind of get a little more realistic look to it, I suppose, or a little more drama in the mountains, which that's my favorite part of the mountains, is they're very dramatic looking. One of the goofy things about using this tapping technique is that because the paint kind of smudges in a pattern, you start to get these repeating elements as you're tapping it out. In some areas that looks kind of goofy, and in other areas it seems to really work well on the painting. Now it's just repeat those same techniques until you're happy with kind of how it turns out. At this point, I decided it was about as good as it was going to get, so I needed to sign it, and my thought here was I could kind of create a paintbrush of paint by getting enough glob that I might be able to drag the tip formed by the paint glob, and that didn't work so good. So this was actually the hardest part of doing the painting. Overall, I was pretty happy with how this turned out. Turned out better than I thought it would. My hands didn't even get as messy as I thought they would. I, for some reason, kept this a little more clean than I normally do. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like more videos like this, please subscribe.